When the drought hit harder than any in living memory, they laughed at his rusted wagon and leaky barrels. But when the wells went dry and the sun baked the land bare, he came rolling through the dust with water to spare. The heat was a thing alive that summer. It didn't just burn, it pressed, smothered, weighed down on every back that dared to labor beneath it. The air itself shimmered, a cruel mirage made of exhaustion and thirst, and every man, woman, and beast across the plains had come to learn what it meant to live at the mercy of a sun that no longer seemed to sleep. The creeks had gone first, shrinking into mud veins. Then the wells started to cough up dust, then air, then nothing. And when the river itself turned shallow and slow as syrup, people began to look at one another differently, like cattle too long penned in one corral. The man everyone now called Crazy Jonas had been talking about his contraption since spring. A wagon, he said, that could haul more water than a dozen barrels and keep it cool as a mountain spring. The others had laughed. They always did. Jonas had been an odd one ever since his wife died 3 summers ago. His mind had turned inward, and his hands had turned restless. Folks in town figured that was fine as long as he kept to his side of the flats. But when he came riding into the blacksmith's yard, with that rattling monstrosity behind his mule, patched with tin sheets, copper pipes, and the carcass of an old boiler, even the patient ones couldn't help but grin. "Looks like you built yourself a rolling coffin, Jonas," old Weller said, wiping sweat from his brow. "You expecting to haul ghosts in it?" Jonas didn't answer. He just climbed down, his boots stirring little clouds of dust, and tapped a pipe with a wrench as though listening for a heartbeat. His shirt was dark with sweat, and his beard had gone grey where the soot and oil had settled in. To him, the laughter didn't seem to register. He just whispered something to himself about pressure valves and condensation coils, then hitched the mule and went on toward the dry gulch. They forgot about him soon enough, until the wind shifted. Weeks later, while most of the county was watching their cattle collapse under the weight of their own thirst, Jonas was seen hauling something up from the canyon. Slow, deliberate, a single mule dragging a heavy load that looked darker than anything else left under the sun. The children ran alongside it, calling out, "Crazy Jonas and his junk wagon!" But the grown men weren't laughing anymore. The wagon groaned with weight. The barrels inside didn't clank hollow. They thudded deep and full. When he finally pulled into the square at Dry Creek Crossing, people came out from every porch and shade. The sheriff stepped off the boardwalk, thumb hooked through his belt. "You got something in there, Jonas?" he asked, eyeing the wagon like it might explode. Jonas didn't. "Speak!" He climbed down, reached under the tarp, and turned a brass valve. A trickle of clear, cold water poured out into the dirt, darkening it. The sound of it was more shocking than a gunshot. No one moved. Then a child gasped, the little Harper boy, and ran forward, cupping his hands under the stream before his mother snatched him back. Jonas straightened, his cracked lips twitching into what might have been a smile. "Told you," he said. "Told you it'd work." But nobody asked how. They just stared as the water hissed on the ground, turning to steam under the merciless sun. What they didn't see, not yet, was what Jonas had given up for it. The nights without sleep, the scavenged copper from broken stills and dead engines, the endless tinkering in the canyon where no one went anymore because the heat itself felt haunted. There were voices, people said, carried on the wind at night, faint metal groans and murmurs like prayers. Some said they were just echoes. Others said Jonas was down there talking to the ghosts of the miners who died when the tunnels caved years before. Maybe he was. Maybe that's where he found the parts that made his water wagon more than junk. But the real story, the part no one knew, began long before the drought broke them. It started when Jonas buried his wife and swore he'd never let the land win again. That promise rotted into obsession, and obsession turned into the thing that stood before them now, steaming and hissing like a beast pulled out of hell itself. The sheriff leaned in closer, listening to the strange heartbeat of the pipes. "You better tell me what's in there," he said quietly. Jonas looked him in the eye. "Just water," he said. "The kind you forgot how to find." Then the sheriff noticed something else, a faint hum coming from within the barrels, a pulse, almost mechanical, and a smell, metallic and sharp, not quite natural. Jonas saw the doubt in his eyes and turned away. "You'll understand soon enough," he said, and began unhooking the mule. That night, as the town tried to sleep in the shallow cool of dusk, the sound of the wagon's strange hum drifted through the alleys and fields. Dogs barked and fell silent. The children dreamt of rivers that didn't exist. And up on the hill above Dry Creek, Jonas stood beside his creation, staring at the starlight trembling in the metal. He placed a hand on one of the barrels. It was cold, impossibly cold, and he whispered her name. When dawn came, he was gone. The wagon too, but the ground where it had stood was damp, as though it had rained in that one patch of earth and nowhere else. The next day, the Harper's well, which had been dry for months, started to gurgle again. And that's when people started to talk, really talk, about what Jonas had done down there in the canyon, about whether he'd made a machine or found something that shouldn't have been found, about whether it was water he'd brought back, or something else that only looked like it. The morning Jonas vanished was the first time Dry Creek Crossing felt truly afraid of him. Before, he had been the town oddity, the lonely widower tinkering with scraps, the man people gossiped about when trying to distract themselves from their own troubles. But the night his wagon hummed like a living thing atop the hill, and the ground beneath it stayed cold and damp when everything else baked dry, people woke with a new unease tight in their ribs. Men who'd lived through Indian raids, who'd seen tornadoes touch the earth like the finger of God, who'd survived cattle stampedes and fever seasons, all found themselves glancing at one another as though checking whether anyone else had felt it too, that faint tremor of dread in their chest. By noon that same day, the Harpers' miraculous well had pulled half the town onto their property. It wasn't much, just a sluggish trickle that settled into a shallow pool. But in a place where water had become as sacred as scripture itself, even a trickle was enough to make grown men stare at the ground like they were afraid to blink. The sheriff had tried to keep order, but folks weren't thirsty for chaos. They were thirsty for answers. They circled the well like a congregation around a preacher, waiting for someone to tell them what miracle they were witnessing and what price would come with it. Mrs. Harper kept insisting she'd done nothing different, that the water just came. But the glances traded between the townsfolk weren't for her. They all remembered Jonas on that hill. They remembered the cold metal and the humming barrels, and the water steaming as it touched the earth. And though no one said it aloud, every mind in Dry Creek turned toward the same question. What did Jonas do, and why had he come back only to leave again? The sheriff, a man named Halford Briggs, grey-haired, stiff-backed, and worn down by enough burdens to fill 2 lifetimes, saddled his horse that afternoon and told the deputy to mind the town while he went looking for answers. "If he's got water," Briggs said, tugging at the reins with hands that trembled slightly, "it belongs to everyone, not just him." But everyone watching him mount up knew the truth. He wasn't riding after water. He was riding after a man they'd all underestimated, a man who'd built something they didn't understand. And though he didn't admit it, Sheriff Briggs felt something else stirring inside him, a faint wrongness, like the shift in the wind before a storm the sky hasn't yet shown. He followed Jonas's tracks westward, toward the canyon the miners had abandoned years ago when the tunnels collapsed. The trail was narrow and fragile, the dust rising in shimmering veils that seemed almost alive in the heat. Hours passed, the sun sinking lower but never softening, and eventually he found not Jonas, but the first sign of something wrong. A circle of dead grass, a patch the size of a wagon, perfectly round, perfectly dry, not from thirst, but as though it had burned out from within. There was no ash, no scorch marks, just a dead spot in the world, carved too precisely to be natural. Briggs dismounted, crouching low, running a finger across the brittle remains. They crumbled under his touch like they'd turned to powder. He lifted the dust to his nose and smelled something faint. Copper, metal, something like the scent rising from a hot iron quenching in water. He had smelled it 1,000 times in the blacksmith's shop, but never in the middle of prairie grass. "What in God's name are you doing, Jonas?" he muttered. The horse grew restless, snorting, stepping sideways. Briggs stood again, wiping his hands on his trousers, and saw another oddity, mule tracks beside wagon ruts, but both ended abruptly, fading into the dead patch, as if they'd walked into it, and then simply stopped. No departure tracks, no footprints leaving, nothing. It was as though something had swallowed the trail whole. He shivered, though the air was hot as a forge. But Dry Creek Crossing wasn't done feeling strange that day. Back in town, the old church bell began ringing, though no one had touched it. The sound was thin, metallic, as if the clapper were being pulled not by rope, but by the tremble of vibrations deep inside the bell itself. The pastor rushed out, pale as milk, insisting he'd been reading in the pews when the bell began to sway, slow and unnatural. Townsfolk whispered about Jonas again. They whispered about the humming wagon, and they whispered about what else might be humming underneath the earth now. By sunset, 3 more wells, all bone dry for months, had given off faint, sputtering gurgles. Not enough to drink, not enough to save cattle, just enough to make hope a dangerous thing again. People stood around them like mourners waiting to hear if a dying man would breathe again. But the water never rose higher than a few muddy bubbles. It was enough, though, to stir fear instead of relief, because the wells didn't gurgle like water, they gurgled like breath. That night, Mr. Hayes, who lived at the edge of town, claimed he heard metal scraping beneath his floorboards. His wife said he'd been drinking, but the following morning, she heard it too, a faint grinding that seemed to move beneath the house, traveling like an insect burrowing through packed earth. The blacksmith found his tools cold as river stones when he opened shop. Tools left in the heat should have burned his hands. Instead, they were chilled, frost-touched almost. He stared at them for a long while before wiping his forehead and whispering, "Jonas, what did you bring back here?" But the biggest discovery came from little Tommy Ortega, who had been tracking rabbits near the gulch. He came running home so fast he nearly broke his ankles on the rocks. "Ma, Ma," he all shouted, breathless. "There's steam in the canyon, cold steam, like breath, and there's a sound, like singing, like someone singing under the ground." By midday, half the town had gathered atop the canyon overlook, squinting into its depths. And what they saw chilled them deeper than any winter wind. A thin ribbon of fog rising from the cracks below, slow, steady, pale as moonlight. But fog didn't belong in a canyon that had hit 114 degrees a week ago. Fog didn't belong in a place where nothing but rattlesnakes survived. Sheriff Briggs arrived moments later, returning from his ride, and he stared at the fog with grave silence. His expression alone frightened people more than the steam rising from the earth, because Briggs wasn't the panicking type. He was the man who always found the thread of reason in madness. But now he had no words. "What did you find?" the pastor asked. Briggs exhaled slowly. "Tracks, then no tracks. And Jonas? No sign." The town fell silent. A breeze moved past them, cold as well water. Women clutched their shawls, though the sun still beat down with relentless fury. Someone whispered, "He found something down there, something old." But Briggs did not answer, because deep inside him, something had taken root, the unease that Jonas hadn't created something new. He had awakened something buried. That evening, Briggs called a meeting at the saloon. Though no one came for drink, they came for answers. He told them about the dead patch of earth, about the strange metallic smell, about the tracks that disappeared. He didn't mention one thing, though: the way the ground in that patch had felt warm beneath his boots, pulsing almost like a heartbeat. That detail he kept folded into his own mind, like a secret too fragile to speak aloud. But men and women of Dry Creek didn't need his fear spoken. They sensed it. "What do we do?" Mrs. Harper asked, holding her youngest child close. Well, it came back, but what if it's not supposed to?" "We need Jonas," Briggs said, "and we need to know what that machine of his really does." "He made water," someone argued. "Maybe," Briggs replied. "Or maybe it made itself." A long silence followed, and then the ground trembled. Not a quake, not a rumble, just a long, low vibration that rattled the glasses behind the bar and made the lanterns sway against their hooks. The floorboards groaned, the saloon's windows shivered in their frames, and the sheriff felt the tremor echo up his spine like a warning breathed straight into his bones. Outside, dogs howled, cattle moaned, children cried, and from far away, too far to be anything man-made, a metallic tone rang out, low and deep, like a bell struck underground. A bell just like the one Tommy Ortega had described. A bell that wasn't supposed to exist. Briggs's face went pale. "He found something in those tunnels," he whispered, "and it's waking up." And though no one said it, every person in Dry Creek Crossing felt the same terrible thought rising inside them. What if Jonas didn't bring water back? What if he brought back whatever the miners ran from? Outside, the sun began to set, turning the sky into a furnace-red smear. And in the distance, from the canyon, the faint outline of Jonas's mule appeared, walking toward town alone. No wagon, no Jonas, just the mule and something dripping from its harness. Something clear, something cold, something that steamed when it hit the ground. The mule walked into Dry Creek Crossing like a ghost that had forgotten it was dead. Its hooves dragged, its ribs showed like the slats of a broken barrel, and its eyes, those had gone strange, almost fogged, as if something cold pressed inward from behind them. The children watching from the porch of the mercantile were the first to notice the droplets falling from the mule's worn leather harness, each drop clear as glass, hissing faintly when it hit the dusty ground. Steam curled upward in thin ribbons, twisting in the fading light like breath from a sleeping giant. No one approached at first. They stood behind fences, on porches, in doorways. The mule didn't look wounded, not in any way a doctor could mend, but it looked wrong, like something that had wandered through a world it wasn't meant to pass through and had come back marked by it. Mrs. Ortega crossed herself. Mr. Harper pulled his sons behind him. The blacksmith muttered that he'd seen animals suffer heat stroke before. This wasn't it. There was something unnatural in the beast's gait, something that made the hair on every neck stand upright. Even Sheriff Briggs, hardened by decades of hauling broken men out of saloons and burying dead ones from the mining accidents, felt his veins turn cold. The mule stopped in the center of town, lowering its head. A single shudder passed through its body, and then another drop fell. This time, it didn't vanish into steam. It hit the dirt, and the dirt went dark, dampening like a fresh spring rain had fallen on it. Someone gasped. Someone else cursed under their breath. A murmur rose, the kind that curls through fear like a rattlesnake through tall grass. "It's water!" the pastor breathed, leaning forward just an inch too far. No, Briggs whispered. It ain't. The word hung there, heavy and unwelcomed. Because the sheriff had seen water before, he knew how it sounded, how it moved, how it clung to earth and evaporated under sun. But this seemed to eat the heat around it. It cooled the air in a slow ripple spreading across the street. Even the dust swirled differently around it, slower, heavier, as if each speck resisted moving too close. Then the mule's legs buckled. The creature collapsed with a groan that sounded too much like a sigh of relief. More droplets fell from its harness as its body shuddered. A few men rushed forward, instinct driving them before fear could clutch them back, and they grabbed the mule's head, trying to soothe it, but their hands recoiled instantly. It's cold, one yelped, shaking his fingers. Colder than ice. How in God's name? Another started. Before he could finish, Sheriff Briggs reached into the saddlebag. Inside, wrapped in canvas, was one of Jonas's brass valves, the same kind he had used to release the water in the town square days earlier. It was wet, but not wet like it had been dipped in a creek, wet like condensation formed on something far colder than air should allow. He lifted the valve and felt a tremor run through his wrist, like the metal itself pulsed with a faint heartbeat. Jonas had last been seen with that wagon, that machine, those humming barrels. If this valve had come back without him, Briggs closed his hand around it, though he could barely bear the cold biting through the brass. "Where's Jonas?" the pastor asked quietly. "What did the mule bring back?" But Briggs didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the darkened dirt beneath the mule, a circle growing wider as each drop sank into the ground. Water didn't move like that. Water soaked and spread naturally, but this looked as if the earth was drinking it too fast, too greedily, like something parched far beneath the surface reached upward to pull it in. The mule shuddered again, once, twice, then lay still. Silence fell over the town. Not even the cicadas dared buzz. And then the ground trembled. A ripple, faint but undeniable, moved beneath the mule's body like something turning over deep under the soil. The circle of darkened dirt expanded by an inch. Another. Dust rolled off the surrounding ground in a pattern that looked disturbingly like breath. Women screamed. Men grabbed children. Some shouted for everyone to get back. Briggs held up both hands. "Stay calm. Nobody panic." But his voice cracked in a way that made panic grow faster. Then, as suddenly as the trembling had begun, it stopped. The earth calmed, the dust settled, and the darkened circle ceased spreading. It left behind a perfect shape, too perfect. A circle with edges smooth as polished glass. Nothing natural made shapes like that. Night came hesitantly, like even the sky wasn't sure it wanted to step into whatever now lived beneath Dry Creek. The townsfolk refused to sleep. Windows glowed late into the hours when coyotes normally cried, though tonight not even a coyote dared raise its voice. Sheriff Briggs sat alone in his office, the brass valve resting on his desk atop a folded cloth. He kept glancing at it as though expecting it to move on its own. Every few minutes, he reached out and touched it with the back of a finger. Cold, always cold. On the third hour past sundown, he heard a knock on the door, not a timid one, a steady, determined knock. When he opened the door, he found Clara Markham standing there, a widow whose husband had been one of the miners killed when the tunnels collapsed 6 years before. Her face was pale, exhausted, but her lips were set in a line that meant she'd swallowed her fear long enough to walk there. "Sheriff," she said, gripping a shawl around her shoulders, "I need to tell you something about that canyon." Briggs motioned her inside, poured her a glass of the last sips of cool water the town had stored weeks before. She didn't drink it. "When the mine collapsed," she said softly, "they didn't bring all the bodies out?" Briggs shook his head. "Clara, I know that. Everyone knew not all of them were recovered. Those tunnels—" "No," she interrupted. "You don't understand. They didn't just collapse. The miners, they heard something down there before it happened. They said it was metal, singing." Briggs froze. Clara pushed on, her hands trembling. "My husband came home the night before the cave-in. He told me the ground was breathing. Breathing, Halford, like the earth had lungs. He begged the foreman to shut the tunnels. The foreman refused, said they were close to a new vein, said the sounds were just settling rock." The sheriff felt his stomach tighten into a knot. Clara swallowed. "The night he died, I woke to a noise, a humming, like a bell ringing through the bedrock. The same sound I heard this afternoon." She leaned closer, her voice trembling. And that fog in the canyon, I saw it once before. The day they sealed the tunnels, it rose up like it didn't want them sealed. Briggs stared at her, his throat dry as old leather. Why didn't you tell anyone this before? No one would have believed me. They barely believed me about the humming. They said grief was making me see things. She shivered, though the room was warm. But now Jonas did something down there, didn't he? Woke something up, something they sealed in those tunnels. Briggs didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, Clara reached into her apron pocket and pulled something out, a small, cracked metal token, a tag miners used to wear with their names stamped on it. This one belonged to her husband, Jason Markham, except the metal was frosted. Briggs stared. Where did you get this? She looked at him with wide, haunted eyes. Jonas brought it to me last night. A beat of stillness. Briggs felt every hair on his arms rise. Last night? Clara? Jonas left town yesterday morning. He hasn't been back. Clara shook her head slowly. Sheriff, I know what I saw. Outside, a gust of wind swept through the street, cold and sharp. Lanterns flickered, hinges creaked, a dog whimpered. And then, from deep beneath the town, came a faint metallic pulse, like a heartbeat, like something enormous waking up. Clara flinched and pressed the miner's tag into Briggs's shaking hands. Halford, she whispered, I don't think Jonas made water. I think he found the old tunnels, and whatever the miners died running from, it's rising. The sheriff swallowed hard, staring at the frosted metal. When the mule returned, he said quietly, its harness was dripping with this. He tapped the valve. And this wasn't water. Clara's voice was barely a breath. Then what was it? Sheriff Briggs didn't know, but he knew one thing. It had not come from any spring. It had come from below, from the tunnels, from the dark, from whatever had been humming since the day Jonas rode his water wagon into town. He stood, grabbed his rifle, buckled on his belt, and blew out the lantern. Where are you going? Clara asked, fear thick in her voice. Into the canyon. You can't go in there alone. No, Briggs said. But I have to go in first. He stepped outside. The cold wind met him like breath, like something exhaling slowly, like something waiting. And behind him, Clara whispered the words the entire town would soon be forced to understand. If Jonas woke whatever killed the miners, then we're already too late. Sheriff Halford Briggs rode toward the canyon with a heaviness in his chest that felt older than his bones, older than the drought, older even than the dusty town he had spent half a lifetime watching over. The horse beneath him was anxious. He could feel its muscles bunching and trembling beneath the saddle, as if it sensed they were riding toward a place where animals were not meant to go. The bridle jingled softly in the blue darkness of the coming night. Stars flickered above them like the last sparks of a fire about to die, and the canyon, that gash through the land, where miners once swore they heard metal whispers, seemed to breathe out a pale fog the closer Briggs rode to its edge. But he didn't turn back, not even when the wind shifted cold and sharp as though the canyon exhaled in long, freezing sighs. Not even when the horse hesitated so badly he had to dismount and take the reins in his hands. The animal refused to step closer. Briggs did not blame it. He walked the last 200 yards. The ground grew colder under his boots with each step. The sagebrush looked wilted in a way the drought alone could not explain. The leaves stiffened, not brittle from heat but frozen at the tips. Frost on sagebrush in midsummer. Briggs swallowed hard, breath misting faintly in the air. That alone should have turned him around. But Jonas was out here somewhere, and Jonas had not been a man who ran from storms. He dove straight into them. If there was a chance he was alive, or if there was any hope of understanding what he had awakened, Briggs had to go on. By the time he reached the canyon rim, the fog was thicker. It swirled along the edges like the slow roll of clouds settling on mountaintops. Cold vapors rose from cracks in the earth where once only dust and heat had lived. The smell hit him next. Not rot, not sulfur, not the sharp tang of minerals from an active spring. No, it smelled like cold metal, like iron dipped in winter water, like the scent that lingers after snow touches a rifle barrel. He leaned over the edge. What he saw made his blood run colder than the fog. The canyon floor, once rough and broken with boulders and old mining debris, was smoothed in long, circular sweeps, perfect curves carved into earth and stone, as if something immense had dragged itself along the ground, or perhaps as if something immense had risen. He lifted the lantern he'd brought, shielding the flame from the wind. Its dim glow spilled down into the fog, revealing something he wasn't prepared for, something that shook him so deeply he had to grab the rocks at the rim to keep from falling forward. Footprints, not of a man, not of a mule, not of any animal that ever walked the plains. Large, too large, each impression somber and deep, shaped not like a hoof or paw, but like a circle with a single ridge across its center. Like a wheel had rolled over soft earth, except wheels didn't always leave a clean center ridge. Wheels didn't leave frost on their edges either. But these prints, These looked like something pressed downward with purpose, with weight, with cold. His throat felt tight. A whisper escaped him. "Jonas, what did you touch down there?" Behind him the wind shifted again. A long, low note drifted through the canyon, a metallic hum rising from the depths, resonant like a bell struck in a deep cellar. The sound echoed up the walls, vibrating through stone and through Briggs's ribs. He felt it inside his teeth, inside his skull. The lantern flickered violently. This was the sound Clara Markham described, the sound that haunted the miners before the collapse, the sound Jonas heard for months as he worked in the gulch alone, the sound now waking Dry Creek Crossing one tremor at a time. Briggs steadied himself and began the descent. The old mining trail was half eroded, but he knew it by heart. He'd carried bodies up this path before. He'd delivered news to widows with dust still clinging to his boots. He placed each step carefully, lantern swaying, breath clouding in a fog that grew thicker the deeper he went. By the time he reached the canyon floor, his fingers were numb, his coat was rimmed with frost, and the fog closed around him so fully he could only see a few feet ahead. But that was enough to see the first true sign of Jonas's path. Drag marks, long ones, parallel. Something heavy had been pulled across the ground, something built, something with edges that scored the earth like blades. The water wagon. It had come down here, but not whole, not willingly. Briggs followed the marks, boots crunching frost that shouldn't exist. The fog thinned slightly as he moved deeper, enough to reveal machinery. At first he thought it was leftover equipment from the mine, gear abandoned after the collapse, rusted, half buried. But as he drew closer, he saw the truth. These weren't mining carts or broken boilers. These were pieces of Jonas's wagon, metal plates bent inward as if crushed, pipes twisted into corkscrews, brass valves frozen solid, a barrel lying on its side, split open with its inner lining coated in ice that hadn't melted despite the lantern's heat brushing its surface. Worst was the harness, Jonas's mule harness, torn, shredded, frayed in a way ropes didn't fray, as if pulled apart slowly by something patient, something methodical, something strong enough to peel leather like bark. Briggs's heartbeat thundered against his ribs. He crouched beside a piece of the wagon, a panel Jonas had hammered into place with pride, telling the blacksmith it would hold pressure better than any barrel in the county. Now it was cracked clean in half. He touched it. Ice burned his finger. "What did you build, Jonas?" he whispered. "Or what did you feed?" His words echoed upward. Something deep in the canyon stirred. He stood too quickly, lantern swinging. The fog to his left rippled. A shadow moved, heavy, large, sliding effortlessly across the ground like a predator concealed by mist. Briggs reached for his rifle. Then he heard it, a voice, faint, fragile, a whisper. "Halford." His breath hitched. It was Jonas. He turned in circles, squinting into the fog. "Jonas, Jonas, where are you?" No answer, just breath. Ragged, weak breath. Then another voice, softer, not quite a whisper, not quite a moan, something half human, half metal, like a throat speaking through a tin funnel. "It wakes." Briggs froze. "Jonas," he called again, voice shaking. A shape emerged. Not fully visible, just the silhouette of a man leaning against a jagged rock. As Briggs stepped closer, the shape slumped, fell to its knees, then collapsed fully. Briggs ran to it. Jonas lay on the ground, skin pale, shirt stiff with frost around the collar. His beard was rimed with ice, his lips were cracked, his eyes fluttered open, but they didn't look at Briggs. They looked past him, into the fog. "It's awake," Jonas rasped. His voice sounded like metal scraping through gravel. "You have to leave." Briggs knelt beside him. "What happened? Jonas, what did you do?" Jonas coughed, a cough that sent mist curling from his mouth. "It wasn't water," he whispered. "Never was." Briggs felt his heart lurch. "Then what was in your wagon?" Jonas blinked slowly. Frost cracked at the corners of his eyes. "Condensation," he whispered. "Not from air, from the tunnels, from its breath." Briggs felt the ground tremble. Fog parted. Something massive shifted in the darkness. "Jonas?" Briggs said, voice hoarse. "What did you wake up?" The inventor's fingers clutched Briggs's coat. "The miners sealed it," he whispered. "Not because it killed, because it drank. It drank everything. Heat, water, air. It hibernated, waiting for something to warm it." Briggs felt the world tilt. Jonas's voice broke. "My wagon, my machine, it gave it warmth, pressure, a way to breathe again, and when it breathed," he choked. "Sheriff, the wells, the fog, it's feeding." The ground trembled harder. Somewhere behind the fog, metal scraped stone. Something huge stirred, as though unfurling after a long sleep. Jonas's grip tightened in desperate fear. "You have to stop it," he rasped. "You have to." A shadow swallowed the fog behind him, a tall, towering silhouette, something not shaped like a beast or man, something cylindrical, cold, a pillar of frost and metal that pulsed with slow, rhythmic breaths. Jonas's eyes went wide. "It sees you," he croaked. Briggs turned as the fog peeled back, and he saw it, a great metal form half buried in the earth, rising now with groaning weight. Not a machine, not alive, something in between, a relic from a forgotten time, a frozen engine the miners had awakened once by mistake. And Jonas had awakened fully. It towered above them, exhaling cold vapor that curled across the canyon floor. Its surface glowed with faint blue veins that pulsed like arteries, and in its center, a single circular opening, like a pupil widening. The breath it exhaled sucked the heat from Briggs's skin. Jonas screamed. Briggs grabbed his rifle and backed up, heart pounding so hard he couldn't hear the wind anymore. The thing inhaled. Fog swirled into its core, stone cracked beneath it, and Briggs felt the pull. His lantern flickered violently. The flame twisted toward the creature. Dust lifted off the ground. Even the cold air tugged subtly at his breath. It wasn't just waking, it was feeding, and if it rose fully from the canyon floor, it wouldn't stop with Dry Creek Crossing. Jonas convulsed beside him. "Halford," he gasped. "Kill it before it kills the whole county." The sheriff swallowed hard, rifle trembling in his hands. He was one man, one rifle, and a thing that drank heat, water, air, life. But he had come this far. He steadied himself and fired. The bullet cracked through the canyon. The creature turned, slowly, like a mountain rotating to see who disturbed it. And Briggs understood instantly. One bullet wouldn't kill it, but it had noticed him now, and nothing in Dry Creek Crossing would be safe until he found a way to bury an ancient hunger once more. Behind him, Jonas whispered his final warning, voice so faint it barely reached Briggs's ears. "It never stops drinking." And then Jonas went still, and the creature inhaled again. This time, it pulled harder. Briggs dug his boots into the ground, and the canyon began to roar. The canyon roared as though a storm had been born underground and was trying to claw its way up through the stone. Sheriff Halford Briggs braced his boots into the trembling earth, while the monstrous thing inhaling before him pulled every grain of dust, every thread of warmth, every sound toward its widening core. Fog spiraled into its gaping center, twisting like a column of ghostly smoke, and Briggs felt his breath drag out of his lungs as though an invisible rope were tied around his ribs. The lantern in his hand sputtered violently. The flame jerked sideways, stretching thin, then snapped out with a soft hiss. Darkness swallowed him, broken only by the faint blue pulses coursing through the creature's body, veins of cold light pulsing in rhythm, like some ancient heart beating for the first time in centuries. He dug his heels deeper. The earth rolled beneath him like a living thing. The thing was rising, slowly, steadily, impossibly, rising. Each inhale pulled the canyon air downward in a great plunge. Each exhale released a freezing surge of fog that crawled up the canyon walls and spilled across the path like a slow tide. Briggs felt the moisture in his skin freeze, felt the hairs on his arms crackle with frost. His rifle shook in his hands, trembling with every pulse of the creature's energy. Jonas's body lay somewhere behind him, faintly outlined in bluish glow from the fog. The inventor's face was still, eyes closed. Frost settled over his beard and lashes like the touch of winter over a grave. Briggs's jaw clenched. The man had plunged into madness, trying to mend the drought, trying to keep the land from swallowing every last soul in Dry Creek Crossing. He had believed he'd built salvation. What he'd built instead was a key that unlocked something hungry enough to devour the land itself. The creature, the living engine, pulled again. Briggs staggered forward. A few more seconds, and his feet would leave the ground entirely. He threw himself sideways, scraping his body against the canyon wall, gripping a jagged rock as tightly as he could. The cold cut through his fingers, instantly numbing them. He could barely feel them. He could barely feel anything. He sucked in what little air remained in the canyon pocket. "Think, Halford, think. One bullet wouldn't kill this thing." Jonas's voice echoed in his mind. It never stops drinking. It drank heat, water, air. It had lived in the tunnels for who knows how long before the miners disturbed it, and it had killed to protect its hibernation. Now that it was awake, it would keep drinking until everything was cold and lifeless. His rifle was useless. His bullets were useless. The canyon walls also useless, unless he dragged his eyes upward, blinking frost from his lashes. The walls above him rose steep and jagged. Loose rocks jutted out in fractured patches, the kind that shift if pressed or pulled wrong. He scanned upward until his gaze settled on a section about 20 feet above the creature, a slope where the miners had once broken stone loose during their expansion efforts. The rock looked unstable. The fog around the creature had seeped into its cracks, frosting them so deeply the stone shimmered. A blast might shake it loose. Briggs looked down at his rifle, then at Jonas's scattered machine parts, then at his lantern, shattered but with fuel spilled into the frost. He had one chance. He hurled himself toward the nearest metal pipe, one of Jonas's twisted contraption components, and grabbed it. His fingers screamed with cold. He wrestled it free from the frozen ground and ran his hand along its length, feeling jagged edges, hollow sections, and a sharp bend where it had buckled under immense pressure. He wedged the end of the pipe under a large boulder nestled against the canyon wall. The boulder wobbled, just an inch, but enough to tell him the slope above could cascade if given the right push. Briggs jammed the pipe harder, wedging it deeper, creating a crude lever. Behind him, the creature turned, not its head. It had no true head, but the central core rotated, facing him fully, the blue vein-like lines brightening, as if recognizing a source of heat. Briggs didn't breathe. The light pulsed. 1, 2, 3, like the creature counting him. Then it inhaled. The pull slammed into Briggs's back. He grabbed the pipe just in time. But this inhale was stronger, much stronger, and it dragged his coat, tugged his shoulders, pulled the air from his chest like fingers curling into his lungs. He jammed the pipe upward with every ounce of strength he had. The boulder shifted again, just an inch, not enough. He needed more force, more movement, more heat. He looked at his rifle. He raised it, aimed at the lantern's shattered, fuel-soaked fragments scattered under the boulder, and didn't stop to think. He fired. The bullet struck the lantern remnants. A burst of flame whooshed out, fast, fierce, licking up the side of the boulder. Heat shot upward, warming the frost suddenly, expanding the cracks. The rock groaned, shifted, cracked. Briggs shoved the pipe with everything in him. The boulder lurched forward, then gravity took it. He dove out of the way, just in time, as it slid down the canyon wall, gathering speed, crashing into the next rock, knocking it loose, and then another, and then another. In seconds, the wall erupted into an avalanche of stone, shards, dust, crushing weight, all tumbling downward directly toward the creature. It turned toward the sound, core brightening in surprise, or anger, or hunger. Then the rocks hit. The first stone slammed into the creature's side and shattered. Sparks of cold energy burst outward. The second rock cracked into its glowing veins. The third, fourth, fifth, a rain of stone hammering into its metal skin, until the entire canyon shook with the sound of impact. Briggs shielded his face. The creature inhaled again, trying to pull the stones aside, but there were too many, too heavy, too fast. They landed in a crushing roar that drowned the canyon in dust and fog. A final boulder, the largest, tumbled onto the core itself, striking it like a hammer. The glowing veins flickered, dimmed, darkened. The canyon went still. The cold fog sagged and collapsed to the ground like smoke losing its shape. Briggs didn't move for a full minute. He lay there, chest heaving, breath returning in sharp, cold bites. His fingers trembled violently. His skin blew, his boots frosted over. But the pull, that terrible, sucking pull, was gone. He pushed himself to his feet. A mound of stone and debris buried the creature fully. Only a faint wisp of fog leaked from under a boulder, the dying breath of something ancient. He approached slowly. The mound didn't move, didn't pulse, didn't breathe. It was buried, for now. Briggs bowed his head. "Jonas," he murmured, "I'm sorry." The man had been half mad, but his madness had been born of grief, not selfishness. He had wanted to save the town, to bring back water, to do something meaningful after losing everything he loved. He had succeeded in waking water, but not the kind he meant. Briggs turned to Jonas's body. The frost shimmered across the inventor's beard. Briggs knelt beside him, wiped snowflakes from his brow and closed his eyes gently. "I'll tell them you died trying to save us," he whispered. It wasn't a lie. It wasn't the whole truth either. But sometimes, in a land as dry and hurting as this one, truth needed mercy. The climb out of the canyon felt like walking out of a grave. The air warmed with every step upward. His fingers regained faint tingles of life. His breath steadied. By the time he reached the rim, the stars above looked almost familiar again. The ride back to town was quiet. Too quiet. He didn't like that. And when he reached the outskirts, he saw why. Everyone in Dry Creek Crossing was standing in the street, silent, waiting. Lanterns flickered along porches, casting long shadows across drawn faces. Women held children tight. Men gripped rifles they weren't sure they should have brought. The church bell didn't ring, blessedly, but the memory of that hollow metallic tone whispered through every mind. When Briggs approached, the crowd parted. They didn't speak, not with words. Their eyes asked everything. "Did you find him? Is the creature real? Are we in danger? Are we already doomed?" Briggs dismounted slowly. He stepped forward. "The tunnel's sealed," he said at last. "Whatever was down there, it's buried. Jonas died stopping it." A murmur went through the crowd, part sorrow, part disbelief, part relief so fragile It might break from a breath. The pastor stepped forward. "What was it, Sheriff?" Briggs looked out over the people he'd sworn to protect. People who'd lived through drought and hunger and dust storms that stripped the skin off the land. They didn't need more fear, not tonight. And truth could wait until he understood it himself. He shook his head gently. "Something old, something dangerous, but it won't trouble us again." Mrs. Harper began to cry quietly, for Jonas, for fear, for relief. Others joined her, but the sharp, icy dread that had hung over the town for days began to loosen its grip. One child approached him, the smallest Ortega boy, and tugged his sleeve. "Sheriff," he whispered, "is the water coming back?" Briggs knelt down, placing a warm hand on the boy's shoulder. "I think the land'll heal," he said softly. "Slowly, but it'll heal." The child nodded, though he didn't fully understand. The wells gurgled faintly that night, not with unnatural breath, but with settling stone. No more fog seeped from the canyon. The mule's darkened circle in the dirt gradually dried by dawn, and for the first time in weeks, the air warmed naturally. The cold touch was gone. Life crept back in. But Briggs didn't sleep. He sat alone in his office long after the town had fallen quiet, staring at Jonas's frosted miner tag resting beside the brass valve. He couldn't shake the memory of that last inhale, the pull so strong it almost ripped his breath away. He couldn't shake the feeling that the thing deep below was not dead, just buried, just sleeping again, waiting for warmth, waiting for time, waiting for the next man desperate enough to tamper with the tunnels. Morning light crept across his desk. He tucked the valve in a drawer, buried the miner tag next to it, and swore silently that no one in Dry Creek Crossing would ever mine the canyon again. Some things were better left under the earth. Some thirsts weren't meant to be quenched. And though Dry Creek would never know the full truth of what happened beneath their feet, they would remember Jonas, the man who rode into town with a full tank in a dry year, as a man brave enough to seek water at the world's edge, not the man whose invention nearly let something unspeakable crawl out from beneath it. Briggs went outside, breathing the warm morning air deeply. The sun rose gold over the plains, the frost was gone, and with it the breath of the thing that had nearly awakened for good. Dry Creek Crossing lived on, but the canyon stayed quiet, and the sheriff prayed it would stay that way forever.